Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again. This evening, we complete our boundary discussion. Last time we talked about the different types of boundaries. Tonight, we talk about the impact of boundaries. And we start out by looking at how globalization can impact a state in very much similar ways that boundaries can. So, again, we start out by looking at what centripetal and centrifugal forces are. Remember, centripetal forces unite a country, whereas centrifugal forces divide. So, we look at how globalization has been a centrifugal force in that it has created majority and minority relationships. There have been armed conflicts, as we will talk about later this evening. Very much uneven development. We'll talk about that in a later lecture in a different unit, as well as creating stateless nations and ethnic movements within states. However, as far as a centripetal force, they have helped to create national identity and reinforce national identity, preserve national identity. It's helped to develop infrastructure and promote the development within countries. Now, the differences in areas that are receiving that development or benefit from that development can lead to that uneven development that we mentioned earlier. And also globalization as a centripetal force has helped lead to linguistic, religious, and ethnic homogeneity. For example, we talked about English as a lingua franca. As far as religious groups, we've seen greater universalizing religions, the expansion of universalizing religions, sometimes at the expense of ethnic religions. So those are some of the ways that globalization has impacted some different areas. So again, in looking at the impact of boundaries, boundaries can create a lot of different elements, or they can have a lot of different effects. For example, disputes. One example would be a shattered belt, one of our vocabulary terms, a region caught between powerful forces where boundaries are continually redefined. And a great example of a shattered belt is Eastern Europe, and we're going to look at a specific example within Eastern Europe here in a minute. They demonstrate the limit of sovereignty, which is kind of the point of that. All right, kind of the point of boundaries is to establish the limit of sovereignty. At what point someone has the authority to make decisions and things like that. That's part of what territoriality is establishing control. Okay, what's the extent of that control? And sometimes areas that are less under control can be called frontiers, a zone separating two states in which neither exercises political control. There's less control there. And a lot of times, if it is a frontier within a country, it can be oftentimes marginal land or underdeveloped. It can be low population density, different things like that. Great example of a frontier is going to be in northwest Pakistan, which is largely agriculture. There's not a lot in terms of development that's going on there. And it's a frontier zone between Pakistan and Afghanistan. As far as developing self-identity or impacting self-identity, it's definitely important to talk about the differences between national identity versus ethnic identity. And boundaries can have a very big impact on that because, again, boundaries are what define national identity. Being born within a particular area, that's your nationality. Versus ethnic identity, which sometimes isn't as often delimited and defined as far as other boundaries might be. Promoting or preventing interaction. There's three different ways that we're going to look at that. We're going to look at buffers, we're going to look at landlocked states, and we've already looked at supranational organizations in terms of promoting interaction. Buffers and landlocked states might prevent interaction. But we'll take a look at some examples. So we mentioned Eastern Europe as an example of a shatter belt, but even more specifically, Yugoslavia is a great example to look at for a shatter belt because, again, and we've looked at this image before, Yugoslavia was caught right, or what it was part of Yugoslavia was split between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And that's the definition of what a shatter belt is. And it's good to, at this point, kind of reintroduce or recall the concept of balkanization, the breakdown of a state due to conflict among its ethnicities. And in a shatter belt like Yugoslavia, that might be a little bit more common. We mentioned frontiers, and so we can use as an example this one coming from one of the approved human geo textbooks, Cyprus, and whether or not Cyprus is Turkish or Greek. So a little bit of background on this. The island of Cyprus is occupied by people of both Greek and Turkish descent, and you can see it there on the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. The northern portion of Cyprus has actually declared its independence and has named itself the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, though to be clear, only Turkey recognizes it as separate and sovereign. So in terms of international recognition, it doesn't have much. There's actually been a plan mediated by the United Nations called the Annan Plan to try and balance this. And so they've established a buffer zone between the Turkish portion and the Greek portion of the island. And so there's the UN getting involved there. And talks have stalled and been reignited at different intervals. Most recently, they have begun again as of 2015. So little update there. And that UN frontier area was actually used very much as a buffer. And a buffer is, or can be, a weaker state that separates two more powerful countries whose ideology or political views conflict with one another. So on the image that you see here, all of the states in red have been considered buffer states. So we'll point out some of the different examples. What I do is like circle it and out to the side, point out the two major powers who were ideologically at odds. So Eastern Europe, you can see there between the Soviet Union and U.S. allies in Western Europe, or NATO powers in Western Europe. Mongolia, split between China and Russia. Nepal and Bhutan have both been buffer states between India and China. And Jordan was, or is, a buffer state between Saudi Arabia and Israel. So these are all states that were give or take more or less weak. Some have gotten significantly more powerful as time has gone on. But weaker states that separated two more powerful countries who were ideologically or politically at odds. Another impact of boundaries were the creation of landlocked states. And a landlocked state is a state that does not have a direct outlet to the sea. And this can create a commercial and strategic disadvantage for these countries, because for a lot of them, they are dependent on cooperation from their neighbors. And if they don't have a good relationship with their neighbors, that can put them in a really tough position. And one big element of this is that it makes international trade very, very challenging, because some of the largest trading routes in the world are over water, what we call maritime trade. And landlocked states don't have access to that. They depend on other states in order to be able to do that. This is an article put together by, I think, another human geo teacher that looks at boundaries and does a really great job of summarizing a lot of vocabulary from the chapter with additional examples. And so I strongly encourage you to use this as a review tool to get ready and to look at different types of examples, have different types of boundaries with examples. You're going to see in this lecture a lot of articles, a lot of links to outside sources, and this is just one of them. Another article that we could look at is entitled "The 25 Most Controversial Territorial Disputes." And It is a subjective list, but all the same, um, there's lots of different examples that we've looked at in class, in this unit, or different units, or ones that we haven't even looked at yet, but that you might already be familiar with. So I pulled just some of them, some of the ones that might be a little bit more recognizable. So here are some of them. We talked about Cyprus. There is a territorial dispute with Spain occupying part of Africa, Bangladesh and India, Antarctica, Gibraltar, Western Sahara, Somaliland in Somalia, Tibet, Kosovo, Korea, Taiwan, Northern Ireland, Abkhazia in Georgia, Kashmir, as well as Israel. So those were just some of the examples that they talk about in this particular article. In this next article, entitled Photos of International Borders That Aren't What You'd Expect, they use photography, or more specifically in some cases, aerial photography, a form of remote sensing, and allows us to examine what some of these borders actually look like. Because again, at the beginning of the last lecture, I asked, can we see most of these borders from the sky? And generally the answer is no. I mean, we certainly can't see the line that has been defined, delimited, but doesn't mean that we can't see the impact of those lines. And so, again, while we can't necessarily see these boundaries that have been defined and delimited, we can see the impact of them. So, one of the examples that we use, in this particular article, they look at the boundary between Bolivia and Brazil in Latin America, and the difference in deforestation laws that exist between those two countries. And while you can't necessarily see the boundary from air, you can see the impact of that boundary in the way that those two countries handle laws regarding deforestation. And so we can actually see the boundary as a product of what's happened within those countries. Really, really fascinating. In this next article called It's Complicated, 5 Puzzling International Borders, they have a little bit of fun with these boundaries. For example, one of the ones that they look at are a pair of islands, one that is part of the United States and one that is part of Russia. And the residents of Little Diomede, which is the U.S. island, are able to look at the other island called Big Diomede, which is part of Russia and is uninhabited. And in theory, because they are peering across the international date line, they're looking into the future, right? So just a little bit of fun with some of these boundaries, because a lot of times boundaries can be very, very heavy, very, very conflict-driven, so we have a little bit of fun with it. So back to the serious side of things, we're now talking about irredentism, one of our vocabulary terms, and here's the definition. A movement to reunite a nation's homeland when part of it is contained within another state. The piece of homeland that is ruled by the other state is known as an irredenta. A great example of this is with Serbia. And Serbia was part of Yugoslavia, now is its own separate sovereign state. But in the past, right after the breakup of Yugoslavia, Serbia was desiring to add territory that they felt was part of their national homeland that was actually in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And you perhaps remember when we talked about this because of the ethnic cleansing that took place by Serbs and Croats in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bosnian Muslims. And so in this case, irredentism led to ethnic cleansing. They wanted to reunite a portion of their country, but in so doing, they were ethnically cleansing another group. And so a lot of times when the topic of irredentism comes up, we have to mention enclaves and exclaves, all right? Because this can create a lot of conflict and friction and things like that, as we mentioned with Serbia. An exclave, we've already defined enclave in Chapter 7, our ethnicity chapter. An exclave is a portion of a state that is separated from the main territory and surrounded by another country. All right. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a part of its national homeland, but it could be. And so we take a look here. On the left-hand side, we have enclave. Italy actually has a few different enclaves. Vatican City, shown there. San Marino, also an enclave. On the right-hand side, we have examples of an exclave. In this case, Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is fragmented. That tiny portion that's separated by Armenia is an exclave. Russia has an exclave with the Kaliningrad Oblast. So those are examples. The U.S. has an exclave. So I would like to ask, which of our territories is considered an exclave? Surrounded by another state. And hopefully we all came up with Alaska, right? While Hawaii is separated and several of our other territories are separated, they're not completely surrounded by another state, with the exception of Alaska, surrounded by Canada. And another article for you, if you are so inclined. Enclave swapped in landmark India-Bangladesh border deal. 162 pieces of land, home to 50,000 people. Now, one of the lines of the article really kind of caught my attention because it said, quote, most of the people living in the enclaves, 111 in Bangladesh and 51 in India, will stay where they are, but change nationality. And so this agreement between these two states led to people having to decide, okay, are they going to stay? Are they going to go? Are they going to change their nationality? So, think about that for a moment, because this is a product of boundaries existing. If these boundaries had been different before, maybe this decision isn't forced upon people, or people don't have to make that decision. And so it's really kind of an interesting example of how this can work. So continuing on, one of the next examples that we talk about with boundaries is devolution, the transfer of certain powers from the state central government to separate political subdivision within the state's territory. And oftentimes, devolution is a product of centrifugal forces. It doesn't necessarily mean the breakup of a state, it doesn't necessarily mean balkanization, but it could, right? So we have to be aware of that it's just the transfer of powers to separate political subdivisions. And great example of that most recently was with the United Kingdom and Scotland, granting greater autonomy. That is an act of devolution, but it wasn't the breakup of a state. And so we can actually see a lot of different forces that can lead to devolution, and then what happens as a result of that devolution. All right. So some of these forces, as far as physical geography goes, mountainous regions, just as an example, can lead to devolution. The Balkans, the Caucasus, as examples, and because of that, there's been greater autonomy granted. Ethnic separatism in Canada, the Quebecois; in Czechoslovakia, the Czechs and Slovaks. This is something that led to devolution. In the case of Canada, the Quebecois, they were granted greater decision making, but still part of Canada. When it came to Czechoslovakia, it actually meant the breakup of a state and meant balkanization. So something to be aware of. Terrorism can be something that leads to devolution, and we're going to talk about what that means and what that looks like. Economic or social problems. A good example of that in Catalonia. And that is one of the economically strongest parts of Spain. And it is a region that has desired greater autonomy and outright independence from Spain, though Spain does not accept that. And so all of these, irredentism we discussed on the last slide, all of these can lead to devolution. And what then can be a product coming out of devolution are autonomous regions like Nunavut and the Native American reservations we'll look at. We already mentioned Catalonia. We could mention Belgium, the Quebecois in Canada, as far as greater subnational territorial units. And then finally, balkanization, we mentioned Czechoslovakia. We'll look at a couple other examples as well. So again, we mentioned that one of the products of devolution can be autonomous regions. And so Nunavut is an autonomous region that is governed by the Inuit in Canada. And so that is a great example of how devolution can lead to greater governance and control by a particular group. Native American reservations in the United States, also a great example of autonomous regions. As far as subnational territorial units, we see splits taking place within countries still remaining together, but we can see in Catalonia. Catalans have fought for greater independence. Historical examples of why they did that. Under General Francisco Franco, Catalans were forbidden from speaking their language. And this is one of the economically strongest parts of Spain. And while Spain has granted a greater level of self rule, they have not allowed Catalonia to break away. And this is something that the Catalans have desired for quite some time. In Belgium, the largely linguistic differences between Flanders and Wallonia have led to greater autonomy and, in this case, a federal state in Belgium. And then finally, we mentioned the Quebecois in Quebec in Canada. All right, some national territorial units that are much stronger and have greater say as a result of devolution. As far as balkanization, we can look at a couple different examples. The first one that you see up there is the breakup of Sudan. And Sudan broke down due to conflict among its ethnicities, but to be clear, there was also linguistic and, in particular, religious violence in Sudan that led to the breakup of Sudan and South Sudan. But it's an example of how devolution can lead to the breakup of a state. And that's what balkanization is, a process whereby a state breaks down through conflict among its ethnicities. Other examples in Czechoslovakia. Czechs and Slovaks broke down into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And so then you start to move a little bit closer, in that case, towards a nation state. Next one, Yugoslavia. Taking a look at, over time, the breakup of Yugoslavia, you saw in the late 1980s there, all one state, but by the early 90s, had split into 4 states, with Slovenia, Croatia, and Macedonia breaking away, and then later Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and then even later than that, Montenegro breaking away in 2008. And again, Kosovo has declared their independence, but still part of Serbia according to the United Nations. And then finally, the Caucasus region in Russia and surrounding areas, former Soviet republics in this area. We know that Chechnya has desired to break away, whereas Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan were able to break away when the Soviet Union collapsed. Another article here as far as why Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, and we talked about it last lecture as far as a consequent boundary that exists between there, but this article goes into some of the historical, cultural, as well as political divisions that exist between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and why it hasn't outright split away, why it hasn't rejoined the Republic of Ireland, and why it remains part of the United Kingdom. The last topic that we have to discuss tonight is terrorism, which again can be a force that leads to devolution. So we want to talk about it. And it's a major topic of discussion in politics, in the media, and so just in general, it's an important topic to understand. Here is the definition that we will be using in class. Terrorism is the calculated use or threatening of violence against civilians in order to attain goals that are political or religious or ideological in nature. And we've seen terrorism expand in recent years, kind of coinciding with the expansion of globalization and of multinational organizations. And that's going to be a topic that comes up here in a few minutes. it's important to note that terrorism is different than assassinations because terrorists typically target civilians, not military targets. And so you're going to see an example of that when we talk about 9/11. And again, historically, the term terrorist conjures up a lot of different things because it is typically been applied to groups that are outside of any established government, or at least a group that is not controlled by the government. But we have examples because the US government has a list of known terrorist groups, and some of them are governmental entities that we recognize as terrorist groups. And so that's important. And just in general, the term terrorist can oftentimes be controversial because what one side might say is a group is a terrorist, another side might see them as a freedom fighter or a patriot. And so it's really hard to think of anyone considering themselves a terrorist. And so a lot of times that term can be quite controversial, but there are also facts that we can use to define when someone is committing an act of terrorism. So let's look at perhaps one of the most well known acts of terrorism in US history. And since now all of my students were born after the events of September 11, 2001, this article gives a quick recap of some of the major events. But I'll just give you a quick rundown of what happened in case you're not as familiar with it. Perhaps you've heard of it, but maybe don't know a lot about it. On the morning of September 11, 2001, there were 4 airplanes that were hijacked, and 2 of them crashed into the twin towers of the World Trade Center. There were 2 towers that were nearly identical in appearance, so they were called the Twin Towers. The South Tower was actually struck second, but was the first of the 2 buildings to collapse. And about 30 minutes later, the second tower, the North Tower, collapsed as well. During that time that the 2 buildings were struck and subsequently collapsed, another one of the hijacked planes crashed into the Pentagon, which is where the Department of Defense is located. And then there was a 4th plane that was hijacked, but in an attempt by the passengers to retake that plane, the plane crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. And there's a lot of speculation about where that hijacked plane was headed. According to one resource that cited a high-ranking Al-Qaeda detainee who was involved in the planning of 9/11, it was apparent that the target was the White House. Though you're still going to see lots of different sources about where that was. Generally, it's considered that it was headed to Washington, D.C. And I can tell you guys, I have a terrible memory. And so when I was younger, I remember my parents saying things like, oh, I remember where I was when I found out JFK had been shot, or the Soviet Union collapsed, things like that. And I always wondered, I was like, how can you remember exactly where you were when something happened? I just couldn't understand that. And 9/11 is the first event where I can distinctly remember where I was. I was actually a freshman at Coronado on September 11, 2001. And I was on the bus to Coronado, and I remember one of my friends getting a phone call from her mom saying that a plane had flown into a building in New York. And at the time, we thought it was just a terrible accident. But then I had PE first hour, and then I had English second hour. And I walked into English, and I still remember my teacher had a little portable TV, and that's all we did that class period was just watch the news. And so I distinctly remember where I was when 9/11 happened, or when I found out about it. And I've had a lot of students in the past wonder why the World Trade Centers were the target. And so I've explained in the past, but this is actually the next passage I'm going to read to you guys is actually directly from the 9/11 Memorial Museum. And so this is their answer. Quote, the terrorists did not have the capacity to destroy the United States military, so they set their sights on symbolic targets instead. The Twin Towers, as the centerpieces of the World Trade Center, symbolized globalization and America's economic power and prosperity. The Pentagon, as the headquarters for the U.S. Department of Defense, serves as a symbol of American military power. It is thought that Flight 93 was headed to the Capitol building, the center of American legislative government. Al-Qaeda hoped that, by attacking these symbols of American power, they would promote widespread fear throughout the country and severely weaken the United States' standing in the world community, ultimately supporting their political and religious goals in the Middle East and Muslim world. So that is the explanation as to why everything was targeted the way that it was, directly from the 9/11 Memorial and Museum in New York City. One of the most well-known terrorist groups right now is ISIS. And so the last two links that I have here are about ISIS. And so this article is called What a Year of Islamic State Terror Looks Like. And this is an interactive map showing the expansion of ISIS throughout the Middle East. Now, to be clear, the article uses one name, and I've used another. So I want to go through some of the names that you might hear this used as, just so that you're familiar with them. So ISIS stands for the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And so that's probably the name that you'll hear the most, especially in the media. Though if you listen to governmental employees or politicians, things like that, military members, you might hear the term ISIL, which is the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, which extends beyond the boundaries of just Syria by itself into the greater part of the Middle East. The Islamic State is what members of ISIS call themselves, though to be clear, they're not actually a state because they don't have any kind of recognition that would go with statehood, which is why you might also hear self-styled Islamic State, that they claim themselves to be an Islamic State, though they aren't actually that. And then a final term that you probably won't hear all too often here in the United States, but you might hear in other, if you're looking at other resources, is Daesh. And Daesh is actually an acronym from the original Arabic name for the group. And the term itself sounds very similar to an Arabic verb meaning to tread underfoot or trample down or crush. And ISIS does not like this name. Because of what it sounds like, to trample down or trample underfoot. And so several groups have taken to calling ISIS Daesh because it challenges their legitimacy in the region. And so you might hear that term used as well. And then finally, last one, this map shows it's a high school student who maps ISIS's lightning quick advance. It's the title of the article. But in this case, a student actually uses social media to track the changing dynamic in just one country, Syria. And if you take a look at this article, it shows a lot of different groups. So I want to give you an idea of some of the groups that are fighting in Syria, just so that you're aware. So you have the government of Bashar al-Assad, who is fighting. And then you have the Free Syrian Army, and that's the two groups that largely this conflict started out as a civil war between those two. But then ISIS emerged as well. You have the Kurds in the northeast part of the state fighting as well, amongst several others. And so this map actually shows the change in territorial occupation by different groups over a period of time. And so this is just some of the examples that we can use. It's a lot of articles. I don't expect you guys to read all of them, but if you are interested, it's just a sampling of some of what is out there when it comes to the geographic discussion of political geography. So I'll see you guys in class. Have a good one.